Caleb adjusted the straps of his worn-out backpack as he walked home from school, his stomach grumbling from the lack of a real lunch. His sneakers, a size too small and fraying at the edges, slapped against the cracked sidewalk as he turned the corner onto Maple Street. It was the same routine everyday school, then home, where his mom would be juggling 2 jobs and his younger sister, Lily, would be curled up on the couch with a book, waiting for him to help with her homework. As he passed the small grocery store near his neighborhood, he spotted an elderly woman struggling with a few overloaded brown paper bags. She stood by the curb, her thin arms shaking slightly as she tried to adjust her grip. One of the bags suddenly tore at the bottom, sending a can of soup rolling onto the pavement. Without thinking, Caleb jogged over and picked up the can. "Here, let me help you," he said, glancing up at the woman. She looked at him with tired but sharp blue eyes. Her silver hair was neatly pinned back, and though she wore a simple beige coat, something about her posture and the way she carried herself felt dignified. "Oh, dear, that's very kind of you," she said, exhaling in relief. "I thought I could manage, but clearly I overestimated myself." Caleb shifted the bags into his arms, barely feeling their weight compared to the heaviness of his everyday worries. "Where are you headed?" "Just a few blocks down, to Cedar Lane," she replied, motioning ahead. "That's on my way," he said. As they walked, she glanced at him. "What's your name, young man?" "Caleb." "Well, Caleb, I'm Adelaide." She smiled warmly. "You remind me of my grandson when he was your age, always willing to lend a hand." Caleb chuckled. "I just figured you could use some help. These bags are kinda heavy." Adelaide shook her head. "My late husband always said, pride is good, but knowing when to accept help is better. I suppose I still struggle with that." They reached her house, a large brick home with ivy creeping up the sides. It wasn't flashy, but it had an old-world charm. Caleb followed her up the stone steps to the front door. "You can set them on the counter, dear," she said, unlocking the door and stepping inside. The house smelled like fresh tea and something faintly floral. Caleb placed the bags down, taking a moment to glance around. The furniture was elegant but not grandiose, and there were framed black and white photographs on the mantel. "Would you like a cup of tea?" Adelaide offered, moving toward the kitchen. Caleb hesitated. His mom would be home late, and Lily wouldn't mind waiting a little longer. "Sure," he said, surprising himself. Adelaide smiled as she prepared the tea. "Tell me, Caleb, do you always help strangers with their groceries?" He shrugged, leaning against the counter. "If they need help, yes. My mom always says you should do good without expecting anything in return." "Your mother raised you well," she said, pouring the tea into delicate china cups. "And what about you? What do you do when you're not rescuing old ladies from their own bad decisions at the grocery store?" Caleb chuckled. "Mostly school and helping my sister. Mom works a lot, so I try to make things easier for her." Adelaide studied him for a moment. "That's a lot of responsibility for someone your age." He shrugged again. "It's just what I do." They sipped their tea in comfortable silence for a moment before Adelaide spoke again. "I enjoyed this, Caleb. It's been a while since had someone to chat with over tea." "Yeah, me too," he admitted. As he stood up to leave, Adelaide walked him to the door. "If you ever pass by and feel like stopping in, my door is always open." Caleb nodded. "Thanks, Adelaide. See you around." As he walked home, he realized he felt lighter-like. For the first time in a while, he wasn't just carrying his own weight alone. Over the next few weeks, Caleb found himself stopping by Adelaide's house more often. It wasn't a planned decision at first. He would walk past her street on his way home and glance toward her house, only to see her outside tending to her garden or returning from the store with more bags than she could carry. Each time, he would step in to help, and each time, Adelaide would invite him in for tea or a warm meal. It became a quiet routine, something Caleb hadn't even realized he needed. She never pried too much into his life, but she listened when he talked, and that was more than he could say about most people. One afternoon, Caleb arrived to find Adelaide standing on her porch, peering down at a broken flower pot. The shattered ceramic lay scattered across the steps, soil spilling onto the stone. "That wind last night must have knocked it over," she said with a sigh. "It was one of my favorites." Caleb crouched down, gathering the larger pieces. "We can repot it in something else," he suggested. "You've got plenty of pots in the garden." "That's true," she admitted, "but it's not quite the same, is it?" He didn't know much about plants or sentimental attachments to flower pots, but he understood the feeling of losing something that mattered. They worked together to salvage what they could, repotting the plant into a sturdy clay container from the shed. As they finished, Adelaide dusted off her hands and looked at him thoughtfully. "You have a good way of solving problems, Caleb," she said. "You don't just see what's broken, you see how to fix it." He shrugged, unsure how to respond. No one had ever put it that way before. Later that evening, as he sat at the kitchen table helping Lily with her homework, he thought about Adelaide's words. It was true he had spent so much of his life trying to fix things. Helping his mom stretch every dollar, making sure Lily had what she needed for school, pretending everything was fine even when it wasn't. But not everything could be fixed so easily. A few days later, as Caleb was leaving Adelaide's house, she stopped him at the door. "I have something for you," she said, disappearing into the hallway. She returned with a small wooden box, its surface smooth with age. She placed it in his hands. "What is it?" he asked. "Open it." Inside, nestled in soft fabric, was a pocket watch. The metal was slightly worn, but the craftsmanship was beautiful. "It belonged to my husband," she explained. "He carried it every day until the end." Caleb hesitated. "Can't take this, Adelaide. It's too important." She smiled, her eyes warm. "That's precisely why I want you to have it." He believed in passing things down to people who would appreciate them. "And you, Caleb, remind me of the kind of person he was." He ran his fingers over the cool surface, feeling the weight of responsibility in the gift. "Thank you," he said quietly. As he walked home, he kept the watch in his palm, its steady ticking a reminder that time moved forward, whether he was ready for it or not. A week later, as Caleb arrived at Adelaide's house, he found her sitting in her living room, a stack of papers spread across the coffee table. She looked up with a tired expression. "Everything okay?" he asked. She sighed. "Just some old paperwork I need to go through. It's tedious, but it has to be done." Caleb sat across from her. "Need help?" She hesitated, then pushed a few papers toward him. "If you don't mind, I could use an extra pair of eyes." As he sorted through documents, he noticed something. Several of the papers had official-looking seals, signed agreements, and financial summaries with numbers so large they barely seemed real. He glanced up at Adelaide, who was focused on another page. "Adelaide, what is all this?" She looked at him with a knowing expression. "You're curious, aren't you?" "Kind of hard not to be," he admitted. She set her papers down. "Caleb, I wasn't always just an old woman living in a quiet house. My husband and I built a business together, several, in fact. Over the years, we invested wisely, and when he passed, I inherited everything." Caleb blinked. "You mean you're rich?" She laughed softly. "That's one way to put it. But money isn't everything, Caleb. My husband and I lived modestly because we believed in using what we had to help others. That's why I've spent the last few years making sure what we built goes to the right places before I'm gone." He absorbed this information slowly. Adelaide had never acted wealthy. She grocery shopped like anyone else, lived in a home that, while nice, wasn't extravagant, and never once flaunted anything remotely luxurious. "So why live like this?" he asked. Because money doesn't change who you are, it only amplifies it, she said. And I've always believed in living simply. Caleb didn't know what to say. The woman he had spent weeks getting to know wasn't just kind and wise, she was someone who could have lived in luxury, but chose not to. As he left that evening, his mind swirled with thoughts. He had spent so long worrying about money, about making ends meet, that he couldn't imagine having enough to not worry at all. But Adelaide, she had more than enough, yet she still found value in the small things. It made him wonder if maybe, just maybe, there was more to life than just surviving. Caleb sat on the worn-out couch in his living room, flipping Adelaide's pocket watch over in his hands. The steady ticking filled the quiet space, a gentle rhythm that seemed to ground him. Across the room, Lily worked on her math homework, her small fingers tapping her pencil against the paper in frustration. "Need help?" Caleb asked, setting the watch down. Lily sighed. "Yeah, fractions are evil." He chuckled and moved to sit beside her, explaining the problems in a way that made sense. His sister listened intently, nodding along as she started to understand. Their mother arrived home a little while later, looking exhausted but managing a tired smile as she set her purse down. Caleb could see the weariness in her posture, the long hours taking their toll. She ruffled Lily's hair before sinking onto the couch beside Caleb. "You two eat already?" she asked. Caleb nodded. "Yeah, I made grilled cheese." His mother exhaled in relief. "You're a lifesaver, kid." He didn't say it, but he wished she didn't have to work so hard. He wished things were easier. But wishing didn't change anything, so he just nodded and let the moment settle. The next afternoon, Caleb found himself at Adelaide's house again. She was in the kitchen, stirring something on the stove when he arrived. The house smelled warm, like fresh herbs and simmering broth. "You're just in time," she said, glancing over her shoulder. "I'm making soup, perfect for a cool day." Caleb grabbed a ladle and helped her stir, enjoying the simple task. "Do you ever slow down?" he asked. Adelaide chuckled. "Old habits die hard, Caleb." They ate together in the cozy dining room, and as they finished, Adelaide sat back in her chair, studying him. "You've been carrying a lot on your shoulders," she said. Caleb shrugged, not sure how to respond. "You remind me of my husband when he was young," she continued. "He took responsibility for everyone around him, even when he didn't have to." Caleb looked down at his empty bowl. "Sometimes I don't have a choice." Adelaide nodded knowingly. "But you do, Caleb. You just don't realize it yet." That night, as Caleb walked home, her words stuck with him. Could he really have a choice, or was he just doing what needed to be done? A few days later, Caleb noticed Adelaide struggling with an old wooden chest in her attic. Dust swirled in the dim light as she tugged at the heavy lid, her thin arms straining. "Here, let me," Caleb said, stepping in to help. Together, they lifted the lid, revealing stacks of old documents, photographs, and leather-bound journals. Adelaide picked up a faded picture, her expression softening. "This was taken the year we bought our first business," she murmured. Caleb peered over her shoulder. The black and white photo showed a younger version of Adelaide, standing beside a tall man with kind eyes. They looked proud and determined. "You built all this from nothing?" Caleb asked, looking at the other papers. Adelaide nodded. "It wasn't easy. We sacrificed a lot, but we believed in what we were doing." Caleb traced a finger over the edge of one of the old documents. "I wish I knew what that felt like." Adelaide turned to him, her gaze steady. "You will, Caleb. When the time is right, you will." A week later, Caleb was walking home when he spotted Adelaide outside her house, frowning at a letter in her hands. "Something wrong?" he asked. She looked up, her expression unreadable. "Just a minor issue with some legal paperwork. Nothing can't handle." Caleb hesitated. "You sure?" She smiled. Absolutely, but thank you for asking. He didn't push further, but he could tell something was on her mind. That evening, as he sat on his bed, he thought about Adelaide's life. She had built something from nothing, just like his mother was trying to do. The only difference was that Adelaide had made it to the other side. His mother had always told him that hard work paid off, but sometimes Caleb wasn't sure. He saw how much she struggled, how she never seemed to catch a break. Would things ever really change? The next time he visited Adelaide, she handed him a small envelope. "What's this?" he asked. "A letter for your mother," she said simply. Caleb frowned, turning it over in his hands. "What's it about?" Adelaide smiled. "Just something I think she should read." Caleb hesitated but nodded. He trusted Adelaide, and she had never given him a reason to doubt her. That evening, he handed the envelope to his mother. She gave him a curious look before opening it. As she read, her eyes widened and her hand trembled slightly. "Mom?" Caleb asked, concerned. She looked up at him, her expression unreadable. "Caleb, where did you get this?" "Adelaide gave it to me," he said slowly. "Why, what does it say?" His mother swallowed hard, then looked down at the letter again. Caleb had never seen her, at a loss for words before. Something was about to change, he just didn't know what yet. Caleb's mother sat at the kitchen table, the letter trembling slightly in her hands. Her eyes darted across the page, scanning the words over and over as if trying to make sense of them. Caleb had never seen her like this, not shocked, not speechless, not utterly frozen in place. "Mom?" Caleb asked again, his voice cautious. She finally looked up at him, her expression unreadable. This can't be real," she whispered. Caleb pulled out a chair and sat across from her. "What does it say?" His mother swallowed hard and placed the letter on the table between them. "It's from Adelaide." She took a deep breath. "She's offering us money, Caleb, a lot of it." Caleb's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean, a lot?" His mother exhaled shakily. "She wrote that she admires you for everything you do, for helping her, for being responsible, for taking care of Lily and me. She said she knows how hard things have been and that she wants to help." Caleb's stomach tightened. He hadn't expected this. He had never done anything expecting a reward, least of all from Adelaide. "How much is she offering?" His mother hesitated, then said, $25,000. Caleb felt like the air had been knocked out of him. "What?" His mother shook her head in disbelief. "She says it's a gift, no strings attached. She just wants to help us because of you." Caleb's mind reeled. $25,000. That kind of money could change everything. It could pay off overdue bills, help his mom take a break from working nonstop, even give Lily opportunities she wouldn't have had before. But as much as the idea of relief filled his chest, something else gnawed at him. "This is too much," he muttered. His mother studied him. "Caleb, this isn't something we can just ignore. It's life-changing." He knew she was right, he just wasn't sure how to feel about it. The next afternoon, Caleb walked the familiar path to Adelaide's house, his thoughts tangled. He had to talk to her. He had to understand why she had done this. When she opened the door, she smiled warmly, as if she had been expecting him. "Come in, dear." Caleb stepped inside, the weight of the letter pressing on his mind. Adelaide led him to the sitting room, where she poured them each a cup of tea. "I assume you've seen my letter," she said knowingly. Caleb nodded. "Adelaide, why?" She took a slow sip of her tea before answering. "Because kindness should be recognized, Caleb, and because I can." He struggled to find the right words. "I didn't help you expecting anything." "I know," she said gently. "That's exactly why you deserve it." Caleb leaned forward, his fingers tightening around the teacup. "But it's too much." Adelaide chuckled softly. "That's subjective. To me, it's just a small gesture for someone who deserves a break. She set her cup down. Caleb, do you know how rare it is to meet someone, especially someone your age, who helps others without expecting anything in return? You carried my groceries that day without hesitation. You spent time with me, not because you had to, but because you wanted to. You've shown me kindness, and that is worth far more than money. This is simply my way of showing my Caleb exhaled slowly. I don't even know what to say. She smiled. Then don't say anything, just accept it. He sat back, his thoughts still spinning. I don't want you to think I was ever trying to get something out of it. Adelaide reached across the table and patted his hand. I know you weren't, Caleb. That's what makes this special. He looked down at the pocket watch she had given him weeks ago, still resting in his palm. He had carried it with him ever since. This was enough, he said quietly, running a thumb over the metal. She nodded. And yet, I believe you deserve more. Caleb let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Maybe it was okay to accept help. Maybe, for once, it was okay to let someone else carry some of the weight. That night, when he returned home, his mother was already on the phone, speaking in hushed, emotional tones. Caleb knew she was talking to someone about the money, about how it would change everything. When she hung up, she turned to him, her eyes still wet. We don't have to struggle anymore, Caleb. For the first time in a long time, Caleb felt something he hadn't dared to before. I hope. The next few weeks brought a shift in Caleb's home. His mother, who had spent years carrying the weight of their struggles, finally had room to breathe. The constant worry that had etched lines into her face softened. She could afford to take a break, to come home without exhaustion clinging to her. Bills that had once stacked up on the kitchen counter disappeared. The fridge, which had often held more empty space than food, now brimmed with fresh groceries. Lily, who had learned to settle for less without complaint, eyed her new school supplies with quiet amazement. Caleb felt the change in himself too. The constant pressure that had sat heavy on his chest for as long as he could remember had eased. He could focus in class without his mind drifting to overdue payments or the next meal. He could think about the future, not just the next day. But through all of it, he kept visiting Adelaide. She never asked about the money after that first conversation. She didn't expect gratitude or grand gestures. Instead, their routine continued as it always had. Caleb would stop by, help her with small tasks, and share quiet moments over tea. One afternoon, as they sat in her garden, she glanced at him thoughtfully. What's next for you, Caleb? He considered the question. For so long, his only goal had been survival. But now, possibilities stretched out before him in a way they never had before. I don't know, he admitted. I've never really thought about it. Adelaide nodded. Then maybe it's time to start. She picked up a small gardening spade and dug into the soil, her fingers brushing over the roots of a plant. Life is like this, you know. Sometimes you plant something and don't know if it will grow, but you take care of it anyway, and one day you look up and realize it's flourished. Caleb watched her hands, weathered but steady. So you're saying just have to start somewhere. She smiled. That's exactly what I'm saying. He thought about her words long after he left that day. For the first time, he allowed himself to imagine more, to think about college, about what he wanted beyond just helping his family get by. A few evenings later, as he sat at the kitchen table, his mother placed a stack of papers in front of him. I did some research, she said, her voice careful. These are applications, scholarships, grants, programs that could help. Caleb stared at them. The idea of college had always felt distant, something other people planned for. But now, it was suddenly within reach. His mother sat down across from him. You don't have to decide right away, but I want you to know that it's possible. He ran his fingers over the edges of the papers, feeling the weight of the decision. He had spent his whole life putting others first. Maybe it was time to think about what he wanted too. Over the next few weeks, he started filling out applications, researching schools, and considering his options. Adelaide continued to offer quiet encouragement, never pushing, but always reminding him that he had more potential than he realized. One evening, as he walked Adelaide to her front door after helping her organize some old books, she paused on the porch. "You know," she said, "I have no doubt you'll do something remarkable with your life." Caleb looked at her, the woman who had changed so much for him, without expecting anything in return. "I wouldn't have gotten this far without you." She shook her head. "No, Caleb, you would have. You just needed someone to remind you that you could." He thought about that as he walked home, the night air cool against his skin. A month later, an envelope arrived in the mail. Caleb held it in his hands, his pulse quickening. When he opened it, his mother and Lily watched anxiously. His eyes scanned the letter, and then he exhaled a slow breath. "I got in," he whispered. His mother clapped a hand over her mouth, her eyes shining. Lily jumped up, hugging him tightly. And just like that, his future took shape. The next time he visited Adelaide, he brought the letter with him. She read it carefully, then looked up, a quiet satisfaction in her expression. "I'm proud of you, Caleb," she said. He smiled, knowing that for the first time in his life, he truly believed in what came next.